The poachers had left nothing behind but destruction. Michael stepped cautiously through the tall grass, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of blood, gunpowder, and something else. Loss. His hands clenched into fists as he scanned the area, his heart pounding. He had seen this before too many times, but it never got easier. A pride of lions had once ruled this stretch of land, their roars echoing across the savannah like thunder. Now, the silence was deafening. The only movement came from vultures circling above, waiting to claim what was left. Then, a sound broke through the stillness. A whimper. Weak, fragile, barely there. Michael's breath caught as he turned toward the source. Just beneath the cover of a thorny bush, something small stirred, a lion cub. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Its golden fur was matted with dirt, its ribs pressed tightly against its skin. The cub barely lifted its head, eyes glazed over with exhaustion. But when Michael took a slow step forward, it made a tiny, pitiful attempt to growl. Even in the face of death, it was trying to be brave. Michael dropped to his knees, his heart twisting painfully in his chest. "Hey, little one," he murmured, his voice softer than he'd ever heard it. He reached out carefully, letting the cub sniff his fingers. It let out another weak growl before its tiny body gave in, collapsing in the dirt. He swallowed hard. This cub was alone. Its mother, its entire pride, was gone. The logical part of him knew what this meant. A cub this young had no chance of surviving in the wild on its own. The harsh reality of nature was merciless, but Michael refused to accept that. Carefully, he lifted the fragile creature into his arms. The cub let out a small, defeated sigh as its head rested against his chest. It was too weak to fight, too broken to resist. Michael had always believed in protecting wildlife from a distance, in letting nature take its course. But this wasn't nature. This was human cruelty, and he wouldn't stand by and let it win. As he stood, holding the cub close, he made a silent promise. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." He had no idea how much that promise would change his life, or that years later, this same cub would return and leave him in tears. Michael didn't hesitate. He carried the fragile cub back to his jeep, shielding its small body against his chest as he moved. The little thing barely stirred, its tiny breaths warm against his skin. It had already lost so much. Its mother, its home, its safety, but it wasn't going to lose its life. As soon as he reached the Wildlife Rescue Center, his team sprang into action. The cub was placed on a heated blanket, its vitals checked, its wounds cleaned. Michael watched anxiously as the vet, Dr. Evans, examined the tiny creature with careful hands. "He's severely dehydrated," Evans murmured, his expression grim. "Malnourished, too, if we had found him any later." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Michael exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "Can he make it?" The vet glanced at the cub, who let out a tiny, exhausted sigh. "If he fights." Michael knelt beside the small creature, his heart tightening. He had spent years working in wildlife conservation, dedicating his life to protecting animals from the very people who had orphaned this cub. But this was personal. This wasn't just another rescue. He had found this cub in the aftermath of something horrific, and now he was going to make sure he lived. The first few days were critical. The cub, whom Michael named Nuru, meaning light in Swahili, was too weak to eat on his own, so Michael stayed up through the nights, feeding him with a small syringe. He held him close when he whimpered, whispering soft reassurances, letting the little lion know that he wasn't alone. And Nuru responded. Day by day, his strength grew. His once dull eyes became brighter, more alert. His frail body filled out, his soft golden fur beginning to shine. The first time he let out a proper growl, small but determined, Michael laughed through tears. "You've got a voice now, huh?" he murmured, scratching behind Nuru's tiny ears. The cub responded by swatting clumsily at Michael's hand, his playful spirit beginning to show. Weeks turned into months, and the helpless cub that had once fit in the palm of Michael's hands was now a young lion, full of energy and mischief. He followed Michael everywhere, pouncing on his boots, swiping at his pant legs, curling up beside him whenever he rested. It was undeniable they belonged to each other. But Michael knew the truth he had been avoiding. Nuru wasn't a pet. He was meant for the wild. And one day, Michael would have to let him go. He just never imagined that day would come so soon, or that when they met again, years later, Nuru's reaction would leave him in tears. Michael knew the moment was coming, but knowing didn't make it any easier. Nuru was no longer the helpless cub he had once cradled in his arms. He had grown strong, his muscles lean and powerful, his golden coat sleek under the sun. His once clumsy paws were now capable of taking down prey, and his playful swipes had turned into the sharp, controlled movements of a hunter. But the biggest change wasn't physical. It was in his eyes. Michael saw it every day, the way Nuru would sit by the fence of his enclosure, staring out at the vast savanna beyond. The way his ears flicked at the distant sounds of the wild. The way he paced sometimes, restless, sensing a world just out of reach. It was time. The reserve had found a safe area deep in protected land, far from poachers and human interference. It was the perfect place for Nuru to begin his new life. There was no denying what had to be done, but Michael's heart felt heavier than ever. The morning of Nuru's release, Michael sat with him one last time. The lion's massive frame was stretched out beside him, his deep amber eyes watching Michael with quiet understanding. "You're ready for this, aren't you?" Michael whispered, running a hand through Nuru's thick mane. The lion blinked slowly, the same way he had as a cub, as if reassuring him. Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. "I just wish I was." The drive to the release site was silent. Nuru sat calmly in the transport cage, unafraid, watching everything with sharp awareness. Michael couldn't help but think back to the tiny, half-starved cub he had found trembling under a bush. The transformation was nothing short of a miracle, and now he had to say goodbye. When the team arrived, they opened the cage. For a moment, Nuru didn't move. Michael held his breath. Was he hesitating? Did he not want to leave? Then, slowly, the lion stepped out, his paws sinking into the soft dirt of his new home. His muscles tensed, his nostrils flared, taking in the air. Then, just like that, he ran. Michael watched as Nuru sprinted toward the horizon, powerful, free. The sight was breathtaking and heart-wrenching all at once. Nuru didn't look back. Michael knew he wasn't supposed to. This was the way it had to be. Nuru had his own life now, his own destiny. But as Michael stood there, watching his lion disappear into the wild, he whispered, "Goodbye, my boy." He never expected to see him again, but fate had other plans. Because years later, when they met again, Nuru's reaction would leave Michael in tears. Years passed, but Michael never forgot Nuru. He had released many rescued animals back into the wild before, but this time had been different. Letting go of Nuru had felt like leaving behind a part of himself. He had spent so many months raising him, feeding him, watching him grow into the strong lion he was always meant to be. But the hardest part hadn't been saying goodbye. It had been wondering. Was Nuru still alive? Had he found a pride? Was he thriving in the wild? Or had he fallen to the same dangers that had taken his mother? Michael tried to push the thoughts aside, telling himself he had done the right thing. But deep down, he wished for one more chance to see him again, even from a distance, just to know he had made it. Then, one day, fate gave him that chance. Michael had returned to the reserve to assist with an anti-poaching operation. Reports had come in about illegal hunters moving through the area, targeting lions for their bones and skins. It was the same heartbreaking cycle he had spent his life fighting against. As he and the rangers drove deep into the protected lands, scanning the terrain for any sign of poachers, one of the men in the front seat suddenly pointed ahead. "There's a lion." Michael's stomach tightened as he followed the man's gaze. A large male lion stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the plains. His dark mane rippled in the wind, his golden coat marked with the scars of survival. He was strong, dominant, a king in his own right. Something about him felt familiar. Michael's breath caught. It couldn't be. He reached for his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly as he brought them to his eyes. The lion was staring directly at them, his amber gaze sharp and knowing. Michael's heart pounded against his ribs. Nuru. He had grown. He was no longer the young lion Michael had released. He was larger, more powerful, fully in command of his land. And yet, despite all the time that had passed, despite the fact that he had built his own life in the wild, Nuru didn't move away. Instead, he took a step forward. Michael barely breathed as the massive lion descended from the rocks, walking toward them with slow, deliberate strides. The rangers stiffened, hands hovering near their weapons, ready to act if necessary. But Michael raised a hand. "Wait." He stepped out of the vehicle, his heart pounding. Nuru was only a few feet away now, his golden eyes locked onto Michael's. Then, he did something no one expected. The king of the wild lowered his massive head and let out a deep, rumbling purr. Michael felt his chest tighten, his vision blur with emotion. Nuru remembered. And in that moment, Michael knew this wasn't just a reunion. This was homecoming. Michael's breath hitched as he took a hesitant step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nuru stood before him, no longer the fragile cub he had once carried in his arms, but a fully grown king of the wild. And yet, despite the years apart, despite the world that should have turned them into strangers, the bond between them had not broken. The rangers stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't normal. A lion, especially one as dominant as Nuru, should have been territorial, wary of humans, especially after years in the wild. But Nuru wasn't showing aggression. He wasn't retreating. Instead, he was watching Michael with recognition. Michael swallowed hard. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Nuru blinked slowly, the way he used to when he was just a cub lying beside Michael on quiet nights. Then, before anyone could react, the massive lion closed the distance between them. The rangers tensed, hands hovering near their rifles, but Michael didn't move. He knew. Nuru stopped just inches away, towering over him, his powerful frame radiating strength. Then, in a gesture so gentle it nearly broke Michael's heart, Nuru nudged his massive head against Michael's chest. Michael gasped, staggering slightly at the weight of it. His hands instinctively reached out, his fingers tangling in the thick, coarse mane he had once stroked when Nuru was small. The deep, rumbling purr vibrated through Nuru's body, and Michael felt his throat tighten, tears burning behind his eyes. The rangers murmured in shock, unable to process what they were witnessing. A wild lion, fully grown and dominant, embracing a human like a long-lost family member. Michael let out a shaky laugh, running his hand down the side of Nuru's face. "You really do remember me, huh?" His voice cracked, the weight of the moment sinking in. Nuru let out a soft huff, almost as if to say of course. The moment stretched between them, filled with an emotion deeper than words. Michael had thought he would never see Nuru again, had told himself that releasing him was the right thing, and it was. Nuru had become everything he was meant to be. But now, standing here with him, feeling the warmth of his breath, hearing the deep rumble of his contentment, Michael realized something else. Some bonds never fade. Some loves never die. But then a sound shattered the moment. A distant rustling, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. Michael's blood ran cold. The poachers had arrived, and this time they weren't just hunting lions. They had just found a man and the king of the wild standing together, and they had no idea what they were up against. Michael barely had time to react before Nuru's body tensed. The lion's ears flattened, his golden eyes snapping toward the rustling in the distance. His muscles coiled like a spring, and a deep guttural growl rumbled through his chest. A sound so raw, so powerful that it sent shivers down Michael's spine. The poachers must have heard it too. There was a brief moment of silence, a hesitation, as if they were realizing their mistake. Then a voice, low, sharp. "It's the big one. That lion's worth a fortune." Michael's stomach twisted. They knew Nuru. Before he could warn the rangers, a shot rang out. Nuru let out a roar so thunderous it seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. Michael's instincts screamed at him to move, but before he could even process what was happening, Nuru was already in motion. The lion lunged toward the brush where the poachers were hiding, his massive paws thundering against the ground. The men scrambled, caught off guard by the sheer force of the wild king bearing down on them. One of them fired another shot, but it went wide, missing its target. The rangers sprang into action, shouting orders as they moved forward, weapons raised. Michael's heart pounded as he watched the chaos unfold. Nuru, fierce and unrelenting, driving the poachers back, his roars cutting through the air like a war cry. This wasn't the helpless cub Michael had rescued. This was a king protecting his kingdom. One of the poachers tripped, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Nuru was on him in an instant, his massive frame looming over the terrified man. He didn't strike. He didn't have to. The sheer force of his presence was enough to make the man beg for mercy. The remaining poachers turned and ran. The rangers moved in swiftly, securing the captured man while the others fled into the wilderness. Their hunt turned into a desperate escape. Michael stood frozen, breathless, watching as Nuru took one last step forward, his eyes still locked on the fleeing poachers, making sure they were gone. Then, slowly, the lion turned back toward Michael. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling with exertion, but his eyes were the same. Michael took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "You saved me." Nuru let out a low, deep huff, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same gentleness as before, he nudged his head against Michael's chest, pressing into him one last time. Michael closed his eyes, running his hands through the thick mane he had once cradled as a tiny cub. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm so proud of you, buddy." Nuru stepped back, looking at him for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the wild where he belonged. Michael exhaled shakily, watching the lion he had once saved vanish into the golden grass, his heart aching with something between loss and pure, overwhelming gratitude. Some goodbyes weren't endings. Some were simply proof that love, real love, never fades. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of loyalty and second chances. And tell us in the comments, what's the most unforgettable bond you've ever had with an animal? Let's share our stories together. Michael stood there for a long time, staring at the place where Nuru had disappeared into the wild. The wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying the echoes of the lion's last roar. A sound not of farewell, but of strength, of survival, of freedom. He had once feared he would never know what became of Nuru, that he would always wonder if the little cub he had saved had truly found his place in the wild. But now, there was no doubt. Nuru wasn't just surviving. He was thriving. The rangers finished securing the captured poacher. their voices low but tense as they radioed for backup. Michael barely heard them. His mind was still replaying the moment Nuru had come to him, still feeling the warmth of that last nuzzle, still overwhelmed by the sheer impossible beauty of their reunion. One of the rangers clapped a hand on his shoulder. "That lion, he would have killed for you, you know that?" Michael swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah," he whispered, "and I would have done the same for him." The ride back to the reserve headquarters was quiet. Michael stared out the window, his thoughts caught between the past and present. He remembered bottle feeding a tiny, helpless cub, staying up nights to make sure he lived, watching him grow into something fierce and magnificent. And now he had seen the final chapter of their story. Nuru, the king of the wild, standing tall and unshaken. It wasn't sadness that settled in Michael's chest, it was peace, because he understood something now. He had thought he was saving Nuru all those years ago, but in truth, they had saved each other. Michael returned home with a heart forever changed. He continued his work, continued fighting for the wildlife he loved, but something was different. Every time he heard a lion's roar in the distance, he found himself smiling. Maybe, just maybe, it was Nuru, watching over him just as he always had. Because some bonds never break, some loves never fade, and some hearts never forget. If this story touched you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of love, loyalty, and second chances. And tell us, if you had one chance to reunite with an animal from your past, who would it be? Let's celebrate the connections that change our lives forever.